So as we've seen, when Hoxby and Turner provide low-income, high-achieving students with customized information that helps them compare the costs and benefits of attending highly local schools, community colleges and four-year colleges in their city, with public flagship universities, local highly selective private universities, and then a variety of highly selective universities around the country, they were successful in encouraging low-income, high-achieving students to submit applications in ways that looked a little bit more like is typical for other high-achieving students, for higher-income, high-achieving students, and less like what's typical for other low-income students. So what that means is they were able to convince low-income, high-achieving students to apply to more selective colleges that spent more money in general on their students and had higher graduation rates. And they were also able to show that not only did low-income, high-achieving students apply to more selective colleges, they were also then much more likely to attend more selective colleges. So I'm going to start by walking you through that evidence. So what this slide is showing us is that when we look at the treatment on the treated estimates for the Hoxby and Turner experiment, which is to say the difference between the treatment and control group divided by the percentage of treatment group members who say that they remember having received a mailer and having engaged with the mailers, what we're going to see is that treatment group members were significantly more likely to be admitted to an institution that they're designating a peer institution, which is to say an institution that's as selective as we would expect given the profile of the treatment group member. In particular, we're going to see that if we look at this kind of area here, we're going to see that the likelihood of being admitted to a peer institution increased by about 23 percentage points, which means it increased from about 30% of the control group being admitted to a peer institution to a little more than 50% of the treatment group being admitted to a peer institution. Now, it's worth noting, however, that even with this large, substantial impact, we're still seeing a pretty small fraction compared to what we would expect for high-income, high-achieving students attending peer institutions, right? Still half of these students are not attending a peer institution. We can also see if we look at these numbers for less selective colleges, right, 10 percentiles below, 20 percentiles below, and 30 percentiles below, that some of this difference is coming from students being admitted to slightly more selective colleges, right, going from being admitted to a safety school to being admitted to a peer school, rather than going from being admitted to a non-selective college to going to any sort of selective college. And we can see that because of the fact that these impacts on slightly less selective colleges are smaller than the impacts on peer institutions. Another thing that we can see is that if we look at the school that students are admitted to that has the highest level of expenditures, the expenditure is about $10,000 a year higher for the treatment group than for the control group, right? So not only are students being admitted to schools that are more selective, that have higher SAT scores and grades, they're also being admitted to schools that spend more money per student. When we look at where students enroll in college, we see a similar story, although the effects are a little bit smaller. So your likelihood of enrolling in a peer institution is about 13 percentage points higher if you were in the treatment group and you were treated. And what that means is you've got an increase from about 30% of students enrolling in a peer institution, a little less than 30% of students enrolling in a peer institution, to a little less than 43% of students enrolling in a peer institution. And likewise, if we look at the spending of the college that you're enrolled in, we see that it also increases by about $7,500 per student. So these are substantial benefits, right? What this is suggesting is that sending a $6 mailer to a student, if the student reads or engages with that mailer, has a benefit for that student that's potentially worth about $7,500, right? If we just think about the expenditures on that student. And if we take what we know about the benefits of attending selective colleges and think about the benefits of graduating from college, which is more likely when you go to a high expenditure school, and we expand out, we extrapolate out from these effects, we're going to get absolutely enormous benefits for each of those $6 spent. So the result of this is that many people looked at this Hoxby and Turner experiment and said, oh my God, this is the greatest thing that we've ever seen, right? These are enormous cost to benefit ratios. Or enormous benefit to cost ratios. We need to do this on the largest scale we possibly can. And that's exactly what happened. The tragedy is, the disappointment is, that when these efforts, when this sort of experiment was scaled up, it didn't have nearly the same effect as Hauksbee and Turner's experiment indicated. So the first major attempt to replicate this on a larger scale was done by the College Board, right? The institution responsible for the SAT, responsible for AP testing. I'm sure you guys are far more familiar with the College Board than you would like to be. And the College Board essentially implemented a program that looked a lot like what Hauksbee and Turner did. They sent mailers to students' homes, some addressed to the students, some addressed to students' parents, which both gave the sorts of information that Hauksbee and Turner were giving, right? Information about the instructional quality at various colleges, graduation rates, the expected cost of attending a college for that student and that student's family, providing information about a wide array of colleges, and directing students to a College Board website that provided additional information. So in sort of broad strokes, what they did looked very, very similar to what Hauksbee and Turner did. However, instead of finding these very large effects on low-income, high-achieving students, they found effectively zero effects on anybody. They found a couple of small effects on subgroups, but across the board, they did not see that they increased the number they didn't see that they increased the selectivity of the colleges that students were admitted to. They didn't change the colleges that students enrolled in. And essentially what they said, their summary of their findings, was that their evidence suggests that students received the information, but they didn't use it to consistently apply to colleges of higher quality. And that data on SAT scores suggests that essentially data on where students sent their SAT scores suggests that students became interested in higher and lower quality institutions, though even these changes were of a relatively small magnitude and unlikely to result in large changes to observed enrollment. So essentially what they're saying is that rather than finding that giving students this information greatly increased their likelihood of applying to selective colleges, what they actually see is giving students this information increase the dispersion of colleges they apply to. Some apply to more selective, some apply to less selective, and it has really no effect whatsoever on what colleges students actually enroll in or are accepted to. We can see this here, right? What we're going to see here is their estimated effects on your likelihood of attending a 2-year college, nothing, right? A 4-year college, 0. The quality of college that you attend, right? There's no effect at all on the college graduation rate. The effect on the average SAT score at your college is 0.329. Now I want to note that's 0.329 points on the SAT, right? So it brings you up from an average SAT score of 1229 to 1229.329. So this is, again, no effect whatsoever. If we look at the cost for families of attending colleges, they again are going to find that there's essentially no effect, right? This is dollars here, right? So students attend a college that is on average $78 cheaper and has a net cost for a low-income family that is $0.75 more expensive. So they had no impact whatsoever on students. Now, I should say that what Hauksbee and Turner said about this failure to replicate their results was essentially that the College Board just didn't do a good job of implementing their program, that they branded it wrong, that they didn't use the right approach to sell this information to college students as useful. But they didn't really provide much detail about what it is that the College Board did wrong. So it's possible that this is a matter of Hauksbee and Turner settling on the exact right marketing strategy and the College Board settling on exactly the wrong marketing strategy. But the absolute lack of results here does throw some cold water on this strategy for increasing enrollment of high-achieving low-income students. Now, there's a second effort to replicate this, which came from Michael Bloomberg. What Michael Bloomberg did is he spent a huge amount of money providing a set of remote counselors who were supposed to connect with high-achieving low-income students dispersed across the country via remote advising. So essentially what we're doing here, they were doing there. And the idea was he was going to have these advisors encourage these students to apply to colleges that had high graduation rates, had low net costs for low-income students, had all of these positive characteristics that Hauksbee and Turner identified. So compared to the Hauksbee and Turner intervention, this was not attempting to be a $6 solution, right? This was not attempting to be a cheap way to increase low-income students' enrollments. This was intended to be a high-quality and highly effective way of increasing students' enrollments. And whereas the College Board had no effect whatsoever on students, Bloomberg's approach here, this College Point initiative, did have some effect, but it's not very big of an effect at all. In particular, there's about a 1.5 percentage point increase in your likelihood to enroll in one of the most selective colleges if you received College Point advice. So to show you what this looks like, so this first thing here, when we say enrolled in a College Point school, we'll talk a little more about this, but this essentially means enrolling in a school that College Point identified as a good fit, no effect whatsoever. If we look at your likelihood of enrolling in one of the most selective Tier 1 colleges, it goes up from 20% to 21.5%. So not nothing, but nothing close to the effects that Hawksby and Turner identified. And then we see really no effect of enrolling in any of these other categories of schools. So again, what we're going to say is a lot of money spent, a much more intensive intervention, and really nothing close to these kind of big, impressive results that we were expecting based on Hawksby and Turner. However, there's a third approach that came out of this Hawksby and Turner research, came out of this identification of this very large number of high-achieving low-income students who were not applying to selective colleges, that did establish these sorts of very large, impressive findings. And that is the use of tuition-free promises. So this is a strategy that we've talked about before. We talked about it in the social distancing paper, right? But this is a strategy that consists of essentially assuring a group of students that if they're sufficiently successful in high school, they will be able to attend college tuition-free. So one recent evaluation of this sort of program looked at a tuition-free promise at the University of Michigan. Essentially what happened was the University of Michigan agreed to promise a group of high-achieving low-income students that if they were to apply to the University of Michigan, they would receive 4 years of tuition and fees completely paid for, so they wouldn't have to pay any tuition and fees if they were accepted to the University of Michigan. And they were told that based on their grades and their SAT scores, that they would be a strong applicant for the University of Michigan. So they were encouraged to apply, and they were told that if they applied and were accepted, they would not have to pay tuition for the entire 4 years of college. It's important to note that because of the group of students targeted, because the students that were targeted were low-income students, they were very unlikely to have had to pay tuition or fees anyway. 90% of students in the control group who were accepted to the University of Michigan, and 90% of students who have the same profile as these students, get full tuition and full fees paid for over the course of 4 years. So this was, again, an information intervention much more than it was an actual transfer of money. But unlike Bloomberg's attempts to replicate Hawksby and Turner's results, and unlike the College Board's attempts to replicate Hawksby and Turner's results, this attempt actually yielded these sorts of large gains that we were hoping for. Your likelihood of applying to the University of Michigan increased from 26% in the control group to 67% in the treatment group. Your likelihood of enrolling in the University of Michigan increased from 12% to 27%. And this wasn't about students who would have gone to a selective college choosing to enroll in the University of Michigan. The entirety of this enrollment increase came from students that would have either attended colleges less selective than the University of Michigan or not gone to college at all. So what this table is doing is showing us these results of the tuition-free promise at the University of Michigan, broken down by whether you're receiving free lunch, meaning you're a very low income family, or you're receiving reduced price lunch. You're from a slightly less low income family. And what we can see here is, for both of these groups, your likelihood of applying to the University of Michigan more than doubles, right? For the free lunch group, from 27% likelihood to about a 69% likelihood of applying to the University of Michigan. Your likelihood of being admitted to the University of Michigan doubles, right? From 15% to 32%. And your likelihood of being enrolled in the University of Michigan more than doubles, right? From 11% to 26%, if you're in the free lunch category. So these are the sorts of big, impressive, exciting results that we were hoping for from giving students access to information about the kind of financial aid that's available to them when they attend selective colleges, and also about their strong probability of being accepted if they apply to selective colleges. We can also see, as I said, that this is not about students going to the University of Michigan instead of another selective college. If we look at your likelihood of attending a competitive college other than the University of Michigan, the effect is 0. Instead, what's happening is that you're increasing your likelihood of attending a 4-year college, but although not as much as you're increasing your likelihood of going to U Michigan, reducing your likelihood of going to community college, increasing your likelihood of going to any college at all. And this is really where people are being drawn from. So about 4% are going to the University of Michigan instead of not going to college. About 3.5% are going to the University of Michigan instead of going to a 2-year college. And about 7% are going to the University of Michigan instead of going to a college less selective than the University of Michigan. So this is really delivering on this promise of inducing some of these high-achieving low-income students who were not going to a selective college to go into a college that more closely matches their academic preparation. So if we look at this evidence in total, if we look at Hauksbee and Turner's work and we look at the work that followed them, this leads to the question of, should we conclude that there's a large number of high-achieving low-income students who are not attending selective colleges because of a lack of information about the application process, the availability of financial aid, or the feasibility of being accepted to these colleges? Or should we conclude that there are other barriers that are more significant preventing high-achieving low-income students from attending colleges that match their level of academic preparation? So I would say there's kind of a couple things I think about here. So the first thing is, if we go back to Hauksbee and Turner's work, it's very promising, but even Hauksbee and Turner's results did not suggest that most high-achieving low-income students were induced to attend selective colleges. There's still a very large contingent of the students who received their information who didn't respond to their information at all, or who did engage with the information but didn't decide to attend selective colleges. So in the best case scenario, we could look at that result and say, well, they did one version of an information intervention. If we did the best version of an information intervention, we should have amazing consequences. But when other people tried to do more heavily resourced information interventions, instead of finding bigger results, they found smaller results. The only exception to this is tuition-free promises to more local universities, right? The University of Michigan for students in Michigan, which suggests to me that this might be about, that we might need to take more seriously the idea that low-income, high-achieving students are not necessarily willing, or at least a large fraction of low-income, high-achieving students might not necessarily be willing to attend colleges that are very far from their families, very far from their friends, very far from the environment in which they're comfortable. So one possible explanation for why some of these interventions were not as successful as their creators hoped is that they might have been more focused on the resources and selectiveness of the colleges they were encouraging students to apply to, and less focused on other aspects of college fit. Things like nearness to family, things like cultural comfort, etc. So I want to leave you with a quote from a journalist named Paul Tuff, who talked to some of the college counselors involved in College Point. This was the Bloomberg Intervention. And he says, College Point's rules required them to encourage students to choose a college from a prepared list of 270 schools, compiled by the Aspen Institute, where at least 70% of students were able to graduate with a BA in at least 6 years. College Point counted an advising rate as a success only if the student ended up enrolling in an Aspen 270 college. But the advisors I spoke to found that the Aspen list to be rigid and arbitrary. In the real world of high school students, they believed, sometimes a school that wasn't on the list was a better choice than a school that was. For instance, the only historically black college on the list was Spelman, a women's college. For certain young black men, the advisors believed, a historically black college like Howard or Morehouse might be a better choice than a majority white college with a higher graduation. So what this is, the argument that this is making, right, is that if we take seriously the idea that people are making their decisions not just on the basis of what's best for them as an individual or what has the highest return for them as an individual, but also on the basis of their connection with community, cultural comfort, and social distance from friends, that might lead us to better designed interventions. So in the last video for today's lecture, I want to talk through, instead of focusing on what the effect of this sort of intervention is for the recipient of the intervention, that is for the high-achieving, low-income student themselves, what would we conclude if we thought about the effect that these interventions would have on other people within the social orbit of those students? So both the friends and colleagues of high-achieving, low-income students in their high schools and communities of origin, and also the peers that they will meet in their more elite colleges that they're induced to enter.